If you were fired just for doing the right thing, would you walk away in silence or come back and change everything? The busy lunchtime rush at Grillmaster's suddenly felt as if it had been cut in half when Graham Carson's cold, sharp voice echoed through the kitchen. "You're fired, Emily Torres. This isn't a place for you to play saint. Your job is to serve, not to play charity worker." Each word struck the air like a hammer, crashing through the sounds of chopping knives and half-finished conversations. Everything stopped. A few knives slipped from cutting boards with a soft clatter, as if the entire restaurant had frozen under his verdict. Emily stood in the narrow aisle, the tray in her hands trembling slightly, her eyes flickering with surprise, but her face remained eerily calm. At the far end of the counter, Caitlin Brooks, the notoriously arrogant co-worker, leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, her lips curling into a mocking smirk. "Well, next time maybe leave your halo at home, Emily," she quipped, her tone laced with cutting sarcasm. The other staff members stayed silent, pretending to busy themselves, but their eyes, despite trying to avoid hers, occasionally darted toward Emily with a mix of curiosity and pity. In that heavy silence, Emily neither argued nor begged. She simply took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the tray, and glanced toward the front door, the same door a man had walked out of not long ago. He had worn a simple jacket, sat quietly in the corner throughout his meal, ignored by everyone, most of the staff deliberately pretending not to notice him. Emily was the only one who approached, placing a warm meal and a glass of water in front of him, offering a rare, genuine smile. He hadn't said much, just nodded slightly, his deep eyes softening with warmth, and before leaving he had quietly whispered, "Thank you." A small thank you, but enough to convince Emily that what she had done was right. She had no idea that the man had been watching her closely from the start, noting every gesture, every word, every look. The air in the restaurant grew tense again. Graham stood there with his hands on his hips, glaring at her with visible irritation. "How many times have I told you, Emily? We don't have time to fuss over strangers. What you did only disrupted work, and this is the consequence. You don't work here anymore." His voice was deliberate, as if each word had been chosen to crush any possible reaction. Caitlin let out a sharp, amused laugh. "Maybe she should start a charity instead of working here. What do you think, Emily?" Caitlin tilted her head, her smirk a blatant challenge. Emily clenched her fists slightly, but she didn't respond. In her deep brown eyes there was no fear, only something Graham and Caitlin couldn't read, a strange calmness, as if she had long learned to carry injustice without breaking. She turned, placed the tray down on the counter, removed her apron, folded it neatly, and set it back in its place, her every movement slow but firm. A few quiet whispers rose from the corner of the room. A couple of younger employees looked down, guilt flickering in their eyes, but no one dared to speak against Graham's decision. Emily began to walk away, the sound of her footsteps steady against the tiled floor, as if each step was a silent response to the humiliation they had tried to impose on her. When her hand touched the glass door, she paused for a moment, catching her reflection. Her long brown hair was tied back neatly, her face slightly pale from fatigue, but her eyes were still bright, unwavering. She pressed her lips together, said nothing, and pushed the door open. The afternoon sunlight spilled across her face, turning strands of her hair golden, but also highlighting the faint exhaustion around her eyes. Across the street, inside a black car parked quietly at the corner, a man with sharp eyes watched her. His face was calm, but his gaze carried a deep intensity, as if he were carefully weighing something important. It was the same man Emily had helped, and he was no ordinary customer. In that very moment, as Emily walked away, her back straight and her head held high, he shifted slightly, opened his phone, and dialed a number. The sunlight streaming through the car window glinted off his face, revealing an unusual determination. Emily had no idea that in the very moment she thought she had lost everything, her fate had already begun to change. The small apartment on the third floor of an old building was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking with every second. Emily Torres gently closed the door behind her, slipped off her shoes, and set her bag down on the kitchen table. The room looked the same as always, a chipped wooden table, a sink with a few unwashed glasses, and a white refrigerator yellowed with age. But what tightened her chest wasn't the worn-out furniture, it was the white envelope with red letters spelling "Final Payment Due" sitting neatly on the table. She picked it up, gripping it tightly, her eyes lingering on the total amount due. A raspy cough came from the bedroom, making her glance over. Her mother, Mrs. Torres, lay on the creaky wooden bed, her breathing heavy, her gaunt face pale, her thin hands resting on the blanket. Emily walked to the doorway, gently adjusted the blanket around her mother's chest, forcing a reassuring smile, even though her own eyes were red. On the kitchen table, books and papers were scattered everywhere. Her younger brother, Noah Torres, sat hunched over, buried in law textbooks, his old laptop buzzing loudly every time it processed something. "You're home?" Noah looked up, dark circles under his eyes from studying late into the night. Emily nodded, keeping her voice steady. "Yeah, keep studying. I've got this." He smiled faintly, but the worry in his eyes was impossible to hide. Emily stood still for a moment, then sat down at the table and opened the envelope. The amount for electricity and medical bills was enough to crush any lingering hope. A flicker of exhaustion passed through her deep brown eyes, but she took a deep breath, slid the bill back under an empty porcelain bowl. She had to keep going. Giving up was not an option, not now. The next morning, the alarm went off before dawn. Emily tied her hair back, slipped on her old apron, her eyes puffy from a sleepless night. She wasn't officially an employee anymore, but Graham Carson had allowed her to finish the shifts she had already signed up for before her termination took effect. She needed every last dollar. As she stepped into Grill Masters, the heat from the grills and the smell of frying oil filled the air. Emily tied her apron around her waist, bracing herself for another long day. The schedule posted on the wall looked almost like a cruel joke, her name slashed through with red ink. Yet today's shift was still packed. She squinted at it, took a deep breath, and stepped forward before Graham could say anything. "Can you reduce my tables today? I've been assigned too many," she said calmly, her tone reasonable, not pleading. Graham didn't even look up, just waved a dismissive hand. "Handle it yourself." A few steps away, Caitlin Brooks sipped coffee from a mug with a heart on it, her smug grin unhidden. "Switch shifts with me, will you?" Caitlin said, her voice sweet but sharp, more of a command than a request. "You handle it better anyway." Emily didn't respond, simply nodded, and continued working. Her hands held the tray firmly, her steps steady and controlled. But inside, every word, every arrogant glance felt like an invisible blade slicing through the fragile layers of her pride. By 7 in the morning, the line of customers began to grow. Emily moved like a shadow, carrying trays piled with steaming plates, wiping tables, replacing utensils, doing everything without a single complaint. In the dim light of the restaurant, her face seemed to brighten each time she greeted a guest, her smile soft even though her hands trembled slightly from fatigue. She had nothing left to lose, but she carried herself as if the honor of the entire restaurant depended on every gesture she made. At the counter, Caitlin leaned casually, laughing with a well-dressed customer, her perfectly painted red lips curling with amusement. While Emily refilled lemon water for an elderly table and smiled at a little girl who had spilled her orange juice, Caitlin sneered, whispering to a coworker, "Such a fake saint." Emily didn't react. She only bent down slightly, placing another napkin on the table for the little girl, her eyes showing a brief flash of weariness but remaining steadfast. She wasn't doing this for tips. She did it because it was the only way she knew how to survive with kindness, even when the whole world seemed determined to stand against her. The dim yellow light cast across the small room at the end of the hallway in Grill Masters, a place called an office, but in truth just a cramped space with peeling paint on the walls and an old wooden desk. Emily Torres sat across from Graham Carson, her hands clasped tightly together, her back straight, her expression holding an almost unnerving calm. Graham sat back in his chair with his arms crossed, his cold gaze fixed on her as his fingers tapped a slow, deliberate rhythm on the desk, each tap echoing like a warning of something unpleasant to come. Do you know why I called you in here, Emily? Graham asked, his voice deliberately lowered to sound more serious. Emily looked up, her brown eyes bright under the flickering light, her tone respectful yet steady. I believe I finished my shift well today. Graham gave a dry smirk, a smile devoid of warmth. Finished well? You call breaking rules and interfering with customers without management's permission finishing well? Here we value compliance, not cheap sentimental gestures. His words fell like a blade slicing through the air. Emily stayed silent, her hands tightening on her lap until her knuckles turned white. Without waiting for her response, Graham pulled a printed document from the drawer and placed it firmly on the desk, facing her. I've already spoken with HR. This is official. As of today, you no longer work here. His tone held no hesitation, as if the decision had been made long ago, and he had simply been waiting for this moment to deliver it. Emily looked at the paper. The bold words, termination notice, stared back at her. For a brief moment, something flickered deep in her eyes, a spark of defiance that she quickly buried. She drew in a long breath, lifted her gaze, and looked straight at Graham. I understand. Just 3 simple words, spoken evenly, with no anger, no pleading. Graham raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised she accepted it so easily. Emily slowly signed her name, her strokes firm and precise, no trace of hesitation. When she set the pen down, she rose to her feet, folded the notice neatly in half, and tucked it into her notebook. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to work here, she said, her tone polite and strangely formal, not sarcastic. Graham frowned, watching her every movement, irritated by her composure yet unable to find anything to criticize further. Emily stepped out of the room, her heels clicking steadily against the worn tile floor. Caitlin Brooks was leaning near the counter, her eyes bright with anticipation for some dramatic display. But when Emily emerged, not crying, not arguing, not even looking flustered, Caitlin's smirk faltered slightly. Emily stopped briefly at the counter, untying her black apron, folding it neatly, and placing it gently on the shelf as if it were still something she valued. I wish you all a good shift, she said softly, her calm tone cutting through the room's silence. She walked toward the door, her back straight, her long ponytail swaying lightly with each step. The late afternoon sunlight poured across the floor, stretching her shadow into a golden streak that stood in stark contrast to the cold air inside the restaurant. Her hand paused briefly on the glass door as she caught her reflection. Her face pale, dark circles beneath her eyes from sleepless nights, but her gaze was steady, as if what had just happened was merely a small stop on a much longer journey. Outside, the wind picked up, tossing strands of hair across her forehead. Emily didn't look back, stepping forward without hesitation. Across the street, a black car remained parked quietly at the corner. Inside, a man watched her silently, his expression calm, but his dark eyes deep and unreadable, as if he had just found the answer to something he had been waiting for. When Emily disappeared from sight, he leaned back slightly, picking up his phone and dialing a familiar number. I've made my decision, he said, his voice deep and unwavering. Emily didn't know it yet, but at the very moment she stepped through that door, her life had already begun to change in a way she had never imagined. The next morning, the small apartment was still wrapped in the heavy chill of late-season cold. Emily Torres sat by the window, both hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, her eyes following the thin streaks of sunlight filtering through the worn curtains. Her mother's raspy cough came from the next room, and Noah sat quietly at the kitchen table, tapping his pen rhythmically against his law textbooks. Everything was as it always was, except for Emily, whose mind seemed to drift elsewhere. Each time she thought about the day before, an unspoken weight tightened in her chest. Yet she still smiled whenever Noah spoke to her, still kept her voice soft as she went to adjust her mother's blanket. The sudden ring of the phone broke the stillness. Emily flinched slightly, glanced at the screen, an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed answer. Hello? A deep, warm voice came through, calm yet carrying a strange weight. Miss Torres, this is Julian Ward. We met at Grill Masters 2 days ago. Emily held her breath for a beat, flashes of memory rushing back the quiet man sitting in the corner, his calm demeanor, the depth in his eyes. You were the customer that day?" Julian paused for a second before replying, his tone steady enough to make Emily sit straighter without realizing it. "No, I'm not just a customer. I'm the founder of the Grill Masters chain." Emily froze, the hand holding her cup trembling slightly. She glanced toward her mother and Noah, both still absorbed in their routines, as a swirl of emotions rose within her. Julian continued, his voice slow, but each word hitting with the weight of iron. "I want to meet with you. I believe you deserve far more than what you've been given there." The simple statement felt like a ray of light breaking through the dark corner of her heart. Emily responded slowly, her voice cautious. "You want to meet me? For what purpose?" On the other end, Julian let out a soft, short laugh, steady and impossible to resist. "I think we should talk face to face. I'll send you the address. Please come, and trust me. Opportunities like this don't come often." When the call ended, Emily remained seated by the window, staring blankly ahead. Her fingers tightened around the cup, the warmth failing to chase away the lingering cold inside her. Noah stepped into the room, glancing at her. "You okay?" Emily smiled faintly, so light she barely noticed the quiet flicker of hope in it herself. That afternoon, Emily arrived at the cafe Julian had chosen. It was a small, modest place tucked between two narrow streets, the soft glow of yellow light spilling through its glass windows. She came early, choosing a quiet corner, her hands resting on a steaming cup of coffee as she stared out the window, her heart beating faster than usual. Questions spun endlessly in her mind. Why did he want to meet her? Could she trust him? At exactly the appointed time, the cafe door opened. Julian Ward stepped inside, not accompanied by assistants or bodyguards as she had imagined. He wore a simple dark coat, a phone in his hand, his sharp eyes scanning the room before landing directly on her. He walked over, each step slow yet deliberate, making the air feel heavier for a moment. "Thank you for coming," Julian said, pulling out the chair across from her. He set his phone aside, his eyes locking on hers, calm, yet carrying something deeper, as if he could already see through her. Emily spoke first, her tone cautious. "I still don't understand why you asked me to come here." Julian leaned back slightly, folding his hands together in front of him. "I watched you that day, the way you served, the way you treated people. I have one simple thing to say. People like you are exactly what Grill Masters needs." Emily's brows furrowed slightly, a mix of confusion and unease flickering across her face. Julian leaned forward, his voice low and certain. "I want you to come back to Grill Masters. Not as an employee, but in a completely different role." A heavy silence settled between them. Emily blinked, her heartbeat so loud she could feel it in her chest. Julian gave her a faint smile, his sharp gaze softening with a rare sincerity. "I believe you can change everything." And in that moment, Emily understood that her life was about to take a turn she had never dared to imagine. On Monday morning, sunlight stretched across the stone-paved street in front of Grill Masters. The soft chime of the wind bell on the glass door rang as it swung open. Emily Torres's footsteps echoed evenly against the polished tiles, the click of her heels carrying a rhythm that felt unfamiliar in this once familiar place. She no longer wore the old black apron. Instead, she was dressed in a crisp white shirt, perfectly pressed, the collar neatly fastened, her hair tied high in an elegant bun, her face lightly made up, yet sharp and confident. In her hands was a thick file, secured tightly within a brown binder. The moment the door closed behind her, the room fell silent, leaving only the hiss of the coffee machine from the kitchen. Every pair of eyes turned to her, some filled with surprise, some with curiosity, and more than a few with open irritation. At the cashier counter, Caitlin Brooks, holding a cappuccino and chatting with a well-dressed man, froze mid-sentence when she saw Emily. Her smile faltered, her voice caught in her throat, and the cup in her hand trembled slightly, spilling a streak of milk across the counter. What are you doing here?" Caitlin asked, her voice tight. her eyes flickering with a hint of panic. Emily simply looked at her, her gaze no longer that of a humiliated employee, but calm, steady, and carrying an unspoken authority. She walked to the counter, placed the file firmly on it, her hands relaxed but her voice clear, not loud, yet sharp enough for every person in the room to hear. "Good morning, I'm Emily Torres, and starting today, I'll be the new manager of this Grill Masters location." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room, quickly stifled as Emily's eyes swept across the staff frozen in place. From the kitchen, Kyle, a young server, dropped the stainless steel spoon he was holding, the metallic clatter breaking the tense quiet. Graham Carson wasn't there that morning, but the air was so taut it felt as though everyone was still bracing for a storm. Caitlin forced a strained laugh, trying to mask her unease with her usual bitter tone. "You must be joking." "The girl who got fired last week is back as the manager?" Emily didn't respond immediately. She looked directly at Caitlin, her deep brown eyes cutting through the other woman's facade. "I'm not joking. This is Mr. Julian Ward's decision. If you have any doubts, you can call him yourself." She deliberately emphasized Julian's name, and immediately a few employees exchanged quick glances. They knew exactly what that name meant. The founder, the highest authority. A young staff member stepped out from the kitchen holding a notepad, his expression respectful. "Welcome, Miss Torres. Mr. Ward sent the official notice this morning and HR has confirmed it. I'm Henry, your new assistant." He extended his hand and Emily shook it with a polite smile, a simple gesture that seemed to shift the energy in the room. "Thank you, Henry. We'll start immediately." Caitlin remained frozen, her lips pressed tightly together, gripping her cup so hard the foam spilled over the rim. Her eyes narrowed at Emily, filled with resentment and a growing fear of exposure. Emily didn't acknowledge her, or perhaps chose not to. She walked past the counter, her gaze sweeping across every member of the staff, her smile subtle but her tone carrying the weight of authority. "Starting today, everything here will change." In a corner, one young employee whispered to another, "She's not the same as before." The other replied softly, almost in awe, "She's not just an employee anymore. She's someone we'll have to listen to." The room felt charged with a new kind of air, heavy for those who feared change, but full of hope for those who longed for fairness. Emily walked straight toward the back office, the sound of her heels striking the floor in firm, deliberate steps. A rhythm that declared one thing clearly from this moment on. Grill Masters would no longer be a place of chaos and injustice, at least not under her watch. During her first 3 days as the new manager, Emily Torres spent more time observing than intervening. She moved quietly through each service station, her eyes noting every glance, every gesture of the staff. On the surface, everything seemed fine. The restaurant was busy, orders were going out as usual, and the staff still smiled and chatted with customers. But beneath that polished exterior, Emily sensed something off, like an undercurrent slowly eroding the foundation. On the fourth morning, while reviewing the order system, Emily noticed something strange. 3 consecutive orders had been returned due to incorrect dishes, yet when she pulled up the records, the system showed everything had been entered perfectly, with no signs of edits or mistakes. She frowned, scrolling through the data carefully, her gaze sharp, as if trying to pierce through the lines of code. One detail stood out. The timestamps for when the orders were placed and when the tickets were printed were off by nearly 2 minutes, something that rarely happened unless someone had interfered manually. By noon, Emily stood quietly near the counter, watching Caitlin Brooks laughing with a group of regulars. Caitlin acted busy, but Emily noticed she never directly handled any orders, only delegating tasks to others. When a customer came back to complain about a dish, Caitlin shrugged. "Probably a mistake in the kitchen. I can't control everything." Emily said nothing, only smiled politely at the customer and personally replaced the dish for them. But in her mind, she noted everything: Caitlin's dismissive attitude, her way of avoiding responsibility, and especially the cold, calculating look she gave Emily when she thought no one was watching. That night, Emily sat alone in the office, the dim desk lamp casting long shadows across the wall. In front of her, the computer screen displayed the day's order logs. She opened them one by one, comparing timestamps and checking staff IDs. Her eyes narrowed when she found 3 separate logins under Caitlin's account, none of which saved official order entries. Instead, there were traces of temporary edits that vanished after only a few seconds. A trick only someone familiar with the system would know how to pull off. Emily leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced, closing her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them again, the weariness was gone, replaced by a sharp, unyielding determination. "She's playing this game with me," Emily muttered under her breath, so low only she could hear. The next morning, Emily tried a different approach. She took her place at the cashier station during the busiest hours, something she had never done before as a manager. The staff looked uneasy, and Caitlin raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed. "You don't need to do that." "We can handle it," Caitlin said, her voice sweet but dripping with hidden disdain. Emily smiled calmly. "I want to experience the process firsthand. It's my responsibility after all." As the lunch rush grew, Emily purposely left her terminal open without logging out, while keeping an eye on the other stations. And just as she expected, within an hour, a ticket was printed with an incorrect item. The logs showed that the original entry hadn't been made by her but from another machine in the kitchen, logged in under a different account. Emily glanced sideways, catching Caitlin whispering something to Kyle, her lips curling into a sly smirk. Emily kept her expression neutral, her hands moving quickly as she entered orders, smiling gently at customers as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, she knew she had all the pieces she needed to complete the puzzle. "You want to play this game, Caitlin? Then I'll show you you've picked the wrong opponent," she thought to herself. That night, long after everyone had left, Emily stayed behind. She backed up the entire day's logs onto a separate hard drive. Lines of code flashed across the screen, the glow reflecting in her sharp, focused eyes. That night, Emily was no longer just a manager trying to keep her job. She had become someone ready to fight for what was right. And this time, she knew she wasn't alone, because Julian Ward was waiting for her to act at the perfect moment. That afternoon, weak sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, casting long, faded streaks of light across the tiled floor. Emily Torres sat in the small office. In front of her was the hard drive containing the carefully saved log data. Lines of dry text and numbers scrolled across the computer screen, but to Emily, they were puzzle pieces forming a clear picture of betrayal. Each time the name C. Brooks appeared alongside traces of temporary edits, her lips pressed tighter and her eyes grew colder. She knew she couldn't act rashly. Caitlin Brooks wasn't stupid. She had someone backing her, and Emily was certain that name was none other than Graham Carson. But she needed undeniable proof, not just lines of data. Late in the afternoon, Emily called Kyle, the young employee who was often quiet, more of an observer than a participant in the noisy kitchen chatter. She chose a small cafe on a quiet street corner, a place with few passers-by. Kyle arrived looking uneasy, his eyes darting around nervously as if afraid of being seen. Emily sat across from him, her hand wrapped around a cup of hot coffee, her gaze calm but sharp as a blade. "You know what's happening here, Kyle, and I don't think you're like them," she said, her tone steady, every word striking directly at him. Kyle took a deep breath, tapping his fingers lightly on the table as if gathering courage. I don't want to get involved," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice lower, firmer. "You're not involved, but you don't want to see this place fall apart either, do you? You've seen customers walking away, you've seen other staff starting to doubt. You've been silent, but your conscience won't let you stand by." Kyle avoided her gaze for a moment, before finally exhaling, his voice choked. "Caitlin, she said this was just a way to pressure you, to make you give up. But the one actually pulling the strings isn't Caitlin." Emily's eyes narrowed, her tone sharper. "Who is it?" Kyle bit his lip, then let the words fall, each one hitting the table like stones. "It's Graham. They talk on the phone every night. Caitlin's just following his orders." Emily sat still for a moment, her face expressionless, but in her eyes a spark of anger had just been ignited. "Thank you, Kyle," she said, her voice softening but firm. "From now on, leave the rest to me." That night, Emily sat alone in the office, the desk lamp casting a glow over her tied-up hair, her shadow stretching across the wall like a soldier preparing for battle. She reopened all the system recordings, the data logs, organizing them in order. Her movements were quick and precise. She was no longer the girl who once bowed her head and endured injustice. When the clock struck 11 p.m., Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen, the corner of her lips curling into a cold smile. "The game's over, Caitlin. And for you too, Graham," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict. Tomorrow, everything would be brought into the light, and this time, no one would be able to escape. That morning, the atmosphere inside Grill Masters was strangely tense. The staff had been called into the small meeting room at the back of the kitchen, a place rarely filled with everyone at once. Chairs scraped across the floor, and curious, uneasy glances darted around the room. Caitlin Brooks entered with an arrogant expression, arms crossed as she stood against the wall, while Kyle sat quietly in a corner, his eyes avoiding Emily Torres as if afraid of being dragged into the storm about to erupt. Emily arrived last, holding a laptop, her steps slow but deliberate. She placed the device on the table, opened it, and the blue glow of the screen cast sharp shadows across her calm, cold face. "I called this meeting to clarify a few issues. We need transparency," she began, her voice not loud but carrying a weight that silenced the room. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, and an audio recording began to play. Graham Carson's voice filled the room, dry and calculated. "Keep messing up the system. She won't last. Push her just enough to make her quit. She's weak, and she'll leave just like before." The air seemed to thin, sucking the oxygen out of the room. Some employees gasped, others exchanged shocked glances. Then Caitlin's voice followed, urgent but laced with cold calculation. "If she doesn't quit, we'll scramble the numbers until she fails, let the customers complain, let it all fall apart under her watch." Emily stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the room, her tone low but firm. "This isn't a system error. This isn't an accident. This is deliberate sabotage, and everyone here deserves to know the truth." Her eyes locked onto Caitlin. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Caitlin's face drained of color, her arms trembling slightly, but she laughed, a sharp, defensive sound. "What do you all think? You won't side with her. You're all too scared of losing your jobs. You're no better than me." Her voice rose, almost daring them to disagree, but no one spoke. A few employees looked down, some shook their heads in disgust. Then Kyle stood, his voice shaky but firm. "No, Caitlin, you're wrong. We don't want to work like this. We were scared, but being scared doesn't mean we agreed." Emily said nothing more. She closed the laptop, the soft click sounding like the final strike of a gavel. The meeting room door opened, and Julian Ward stepped in. His tall frame and piercing gaze swept over the room before settling on Emily. He stopped in front of her, his voice deep and carrying through the silence. "What do you want me to do, Emily?" The room went still. Emily stood straight, her eyes unwavering, her words sharp and decisive, cutting through the air like a blade. "End it. Today." Julian nodded once, pulling out his phone. His voice was calm, but every word fell heavy, like a death knell. "Graham Carson is terminated effective immediately. No transfers, no second chances. Caitlin Brooks, your contract ends this moment." Caitlin froze, her eyes wide, her lips trembling with rage. "You'll regret this. I gave years to this place." But before she could finish, a company security staff member stepped in, gesturing for her to leave. No one defended her. No one even looked her way. The door closed behind Caitlin, and the room seemed to breathe again, the tension breaking at last. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over the remaining staff. "We start over from here," she said, her voice softer now, but still carrying the strength of someone who had fought to restore justice. And for the first time in weeks, in that little meeting room, applause broke out soft, but full of meaning, like a promise of a new beginning. The next day, Grill Masters opened as usual, but the atmosphere inside had completely changed. There were no more suspicious glances, no more whispers behind the kitchen counter. Instead, there were focused eyes and a surprising sense of serious dedication. Emily Torres walked through the rows of tables, clipboard in hand, taking notes on customer feedback and occasionally stopping to talk to new staff members who still looked a little unsure of themselves. On the first morning after the storm, she began with a quick meeting. There were no raised voices, no threats. Emily spoke briefly, her tone calm but full of determination. "We are going to do what should have been done from the beginning, serve customers with kindness. None of us here is perfect, but we can all try our best every single day." It wasn't a grand speech, but each person in that room felt an unexpected sense of trust rising inside them. Kyle, who still carried some guilt for his previous silence, lifted his head, his eyes seeming stronger now. Henry, the new assistant, nodded as he wrote down the updated procedural requirements. During the busy lunch rush, Emily once again stood behind the counter, not to supervise, but to work alongside everyone else. She moved quickly, carrying trays of food to tables, bowing her head slightly to thank customers with a genuine smile. An elderly woman with silver hair, sitting in a corner of the restaurant, gently held Emily's hand as she handed her an extra clean spoon. "You've made this place different. Thank you, dear." Emily paused for a moment, smiling softly, but inside, those words felt like confirmation that every effort she had made was worth it. In the following days, she began calling every customer from the old complaint list. Her voice was steady, without a scripted tone. "I'm sorry for your past experience with us. We're working hard to change, and I hope you'll give us another chance." Most of the responses on the other end were full of surprise, some were touched, and a few laughed lightly. "As long as you're there, I'll come back." On the fifth afternoon, sunlight streamed through the glass windows, brightening the entire room. Emily stood by the counter watching everything run smoothly. Kyle was carefully checking receipts. Henry was helping a new staff member adjust the way dishes were plated. There were no more complaints, no more doubtful glances. Things weren't perfect yet, but at least Grillmasters was finally back on the right path. At closing time, Emily sat alone in the small office, looking at the notebook now filled with positive feedback. She sighed, not out of exhaustion, but out of relief. In that quiet moment, she realized this was more than just a job. This was a responsibility to keep people's faith alive that kindness still exists. On a cool, fresh morning, Emily Torres stepped into a quiet little cafe tucked away on a street corner. The scent of freshly baked pastries and rich roasted coffee filled the air. At a table by the window, Julian Ward was already seated, holding a cup of black coffee, his gaze distant as he stared through the glass. When he saw Emily approaching, he set the cup down, his face calm, but with the faintest hint of a satisfied smile at the corner of his lips. "Sit," Julian said, his voice carrying the weight of a command yet softened by a friendly tone. Emily pulled out a chair and sat across from him, the morning light spilling over her neatly tied hair, highlighting a face that was both strong and gentle. Julian placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward her. "I've been watching what you've done these past 2 weeks. You didn't just save a single branch. You've restored faith to an entire team." Emily stayed quiet, her hands resting on the folder, not opening it yet, but her eyes showed curiosity. Julian continued, his deep voice firm and full of weight. "There are 5 other branches struggling. I want you to take over as regional manager, help me rebuild them. Not just manage them, I want you to shape their culture, just as you did here." Emily exhaled softly, her heart skipping a beat. She opened the folder, skimming through the documents, the branch names, and the development plans. For a brief moment, she saw herself just a few weeks ago, a humiliated employee standing powerless as she was fired. And now she was being given the chance to change far more than she had ever dreamed possible. She looked up, her gaze steady, her voice firm and resolute. "I'll do it, but not for the title. I'm doing this for the people there, people who were once like me." Julian nodded slightly, his eyes shining with a rare look of pride. The following morning, Emily walked into Grillmasters wearing a crisp new uniform, her name embroidered on the chest along with the words Regional Manager. The staff paused, watching her with newfound respect. Kyle stepped forward, offering a small smile. "You've changed everything here. Thank you, Emily." Emily smiled softly, her eyes sweeping across the familiar room. The tables and chairs were the same. The morning light still streamed through the glass panels as before, but the atmosphere was different now, filled with hope and pride. She stood near the entrance, the sunlight shining across her face. She was no longer the girl who had been fired for doing the right thing. Now she was the reason everyone stayed. A management expert once said, "The culture of an organization is not built by slogans, but by people who dare to do the right thing, even when it comes at a cost." Emily proved that kindness and determination not only saved a single store, but inspired change throughout an entire system. If you believe that doing the right thing is always worth it, hit like and subscribe to help us share more of these powerful stories. And don't forget to leave a comment with the 3 words "believe in people," because it was that very belief that helped Emily overcome everything.